You ready?
Yeah.
Before we begin, let's get one thing straight. I liked El Camino. While for the next few minutes, I will be verbally unleashing my bowels upon this movie, I think it's only fair to acknowledge the enjoyable elements that are present here.
Me like this kind thing.
As per usual with this series, the cinematography is absolutely stunning. The acting is fantastic, and of course, most importantly, there is just so much baldness on display here. On the other hand, considering that this is essentially intended to be a quasi-finale to Breaking Bad, it is a little bit disappointing. Simply just being alright is considered underwhelming when put up against the heavy hitters that have come before, such as Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and of course, Slippin' Jimmy.
What the hell is even that?
But considering this film's status as a finale to a TV show, it's kind of hard to compare it to more standalone films. If only there's some other piece of media that we could use as a yardstick in order to compare this film. If only there's another piece of media that acted as a finale to a popular show, began with a flashback with our protagonist talking to Mike Ehrmantraut, only to then transition into a scene of him fleeing from the police. It's Saul Gone. While both of these stories share some similarities, such as their desires to conclude the character arcs of some of the most popular characters in TV history, the main thing that separates them is the execution of this objective. While one seems content with being fine, the other arguably surpasses the quality of its predecessor. This is how Saul Gone succeeds where El Camino fails. The tone is in a way one of the key building blocks in making any story. Therefore, we can infer that making sure a project nails its tone is pretty important to conveying meaning to the audience. Like, imagine watching a comedy with no laughs, or watching a horror film without any scares, which unfortunately is a pitfall that El Camino falls under. Well, seeing as this film is described on Google, IMDb, and on Letterboxd as a thriller, when you think of a thriller, a few common ideas start to form in your head. Scenes with high tension, and an overall feeling of unease and mystery. Think of films like Memento, Collateral, or even Phone Booth. Or hell, even think of episodes of Breaking Bad itself, like Grilled or End Times, work well as self-contained thrillers. Unfortunately, while watching El Camino, I never really felt this feeling of tension. I've heard many people online say that this is due to the fact that most of us can already tell that Jesse is going to escape by the end. However, I happen to disagree. As you see, by that logic, no prequels or reboots would be able to have any modicum of tension. So, why does El Camino have this issue then? Well, the way I see it, this problem stems from momentum, or more of a lack of it, which I feel can be traced back to two factors: flashbacks and stakes. For a point of comparison, let's use the aforementioned episode Grilled, which means I'm comparing an episode of TV to a movie in order to compare that movie to another TV episode. Listen, okay, there's fucking layers to this. El Camino is pretty famous, or infamous, for its abundance of flashbacks. And while they are well made in isolation, for example, the scenes with Todd are just chef's kiss. Just seeing more of this character that I always felt was one of the more interesting antagonists of the show, even if he is a bit of a chonker. Unfortunately, there are also a weight holding this film down. These extended detours clearly hurt the pacing of the film, as it almost feels like the story has a stop-and-go nature to it, and occasionally it just screeches to a standstill, which is compounded by the fact that majority of these flashbacks feel unnecessary purely from a plot perspective. Like, despite how long the Todd flashbacks are, the only relevant info we learn for the modern day story is that he has money hidden away in his house. Whereas in Grilled, the vast majority of our screen time is spent with Walt, Jesse, and Tuco, and the only deviations we get away from this is with Hank.
Don't lie to me, Walt, you sussy bata.
Whose B-plot directly leads into the conclusion of the episode, which gives the feeling that there's no dead air or wasted space, and every single scene we get is just another stepping stone towards the conclusion, which in itself actually helps bolster the tone of tension as every single scene slowly ratchets up the stakes, and we're allowed to actually spend all of our time with these characters, which allows us to put ourselves in their shoes and feel the tension they do when they're around Tuco. Unfortunately, El Camino is never able to achieve this, which is due in part to the disruptive nature of the flashbacks.
Wow. It's like I'm here with Sinatra.
And when it comes to establishing the stakes, the film is, well, less than ideal. Considering that the plot of this film revolves around the idea that Jesse Pinkman is one of the most wanted men in America, it's kind of weird that you never get the feeling that the police are breathing down his neck. Well, aside from that one scene with Ed, but it's more so played for laughs. Not only that, he's able to hang out in Todd's house for an entire day and walk the streets without much of an issue, which, yet again, harms the tension and weakens the tone of the story. On the other side of the coin, Saul Gone, remember when the video was about that, does a much better job at balancing its tone and conveying its intended feeling to the audience. Firstly, the episode can get away with having a bit more of a slow and less intense pace, seeing as it's less plot focused and instead more so focused on the character of James McGill. Seeing as Gene is apprehended within the first scene set in the present, the episode doesn't really need to balance its plot and characters as awkwardly as El Camino, as Jimmy's imprisonment is basically a foregone conclusion. Instead, the episode uses its runtime to get into our protagonist's head, to show us how Jimmy reacts to the inevitable conclusion of his story. Not only that, this singular focus allows us to see Jimmy slip back into his Saul persona, as we see him, in real time, formulate his scheme in order to manipulate the law and escape the consequences of his actions. Something that we've seen him do for almost a decade at this point, which is what makes the final reveal of his confession so powerful.
Fact is, Walter White couldn't have done it without me. You got that?
As the audience has been conditioned to expect all of Saul's schemes to work in the end, so to subvert that and have Jimmy instead essentially kill Saul Goodman creates a powerful feeling of finality, which wouldn't have been achieved if we hadn't seen every step in the process leading up to this moment of clarity. For example, it brings to mind other situations in the show, like how they prevented Huel from going to prison, which means that, unlike El Camino, this episode is actually able to take its time and maintain a bit more of a slower pace. Not only are they able to do it, but arguably, the episode is better off for having done it. This couldn't have been achieved if we hadn't seen every step of the process leading up to this moment of clarity. If this episode had been constructed like, well, El Camino, then the pace of the story would have been kneecapped due to the flashbacks and essentially the side quests. I can tell you probably have a certain thought permeating within your mind. Considering that Jesse was stuck in that hole for 6 months, do you think he ever had time to beat off? I mean, doesn't Saul Gone also feature flashbacks? Well, while that is technically true, the context surrounding these flashbacks are completely different. Firstly, the flashbacks feel interlinked together and actually have a narrative through line between all of them.
Where would you go first, huh?
Instead of just being random vignettes from Jesse's or Saul's life. In the first flashback, Jimmy floats a question about regrets to Mike, hidden under the guise of a Pony Plays style hypothetical about time travel. In the second flashback, Saul yet again brings up the idea of the time machine, however, instead gets verbally dressed down by Walter White, and essentially has the entire thesis of the show said to him directly in a singular line of dialogue.
So you were always like this?
He'll never change. He'll never change, ever since he was 9.
And finally, at the end of the episode, we as the viewer are non-verbally told the answer to Saul's question about what point he would go back to, in a moment that essentially brings the show full circle back to season 1. What makes the thematic through line of these 3 flashbacks so effective is that It essentially reflects the regret that Jimmy must be feeling within the modern day, considering the fact that he's having all of his crimes and misdeeds thrown back at him through his trial. And what better way to have Saul reflect his regrets regarding his criminal life than essentially have him reface the three men who had the biggest impact in his descent into villainy. Firstly, the man who was the catalyst for the creation of the Saul Goodman persona, the man who caused the downfall of Saul, and the closest thing Jimmy had to a confidant within the criminal world. Even outside of all of this, the flashbacks are contained within 3 brief chunks within the episode, which means they neatly slot in between each act instead of feeling like breaks within the narrative, feel like smaller pieces of a larger puzzle. On the other hand, El Camino's flashbacks feel a lot more slapdash. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things I enjoy about these scenes, such as reflecting the peace Jesse feels in his drive with Jane, with the peace he's feeling as he finally escapes his criminal life. But most of the flashbacks kind of feel like that moment when you haven't reached the word count for an essay, so you just kind of sprinkle in some random bullshit in order to fill space. None of these compare to the absolute worst flashback in the entire film. The vignette that takes place before the duel between Jesse and, this guy.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
My problem with this flashback is that it's a very clear attempt to fast track this guy's conflict with Pinkman.
It's too fast! How could you even tell what's on?
In order to give their final duel any kind of emotional weight. The problem is that it's hard to care about a character if their backstory and death occur within minutes of each other. While he does appear within an earlier scene, considering that Jesse is initially unaware of who he is, it means that we aren't allowed to enjoy any kind of meaningful moments with him that essentially build up his rivalry with Jesse. Considering the fact that Vince Gilligan had a completely different ending for the film scripted, I just can't shake the feeling that this guy was crowbarred in after the fact in order to give Jesse something to do. It's disappointing considering this franchise's history of incredible villains with rich motivations, interesting character quirks, and, well, powerful auras.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
It makes you wonder what this film would have been like if it was just a bit longer and some of the fat had been trimmed out during editing. Then we could have spent more time learning about this character and actually caring about his duel with Jesse. Saul Gone actually does something similar, as the majority of its secondary cast is used in a very utilitarian way as a stepping stone for Jimmy to reach the end of his arc. This would have been like if this random investigator guy during the court case had been given an entire flashback dedicated to building him up. We don't really need to see this, as he himself doesn't matter. The only purpose he serves within the story is to essentially act as a mouthpiece for the government, and well, that's all he does. The only other character in this episode to receive a massive amount of screen time outside of Saul is Kim, but that's to be expected considering that she's essentially the secondary protagonist of the show. Well, at least Jimmy's half of it. The final criticism I would like to invoke is one of necessity. El Camino doesn't really bring anything new to the table, seeing as the film doesn't really alter or enrich my perception of Jesse Pinkman as a character, which isn't great considering that he's the protagonist. The film would make you think that Jesse's arc is him facing his past head on and overcoming it. However, he doesn't really do anything in the modern day sections that would make you think that he would overcome his trauma. There's no reason to believe that the PTSD episodes that Jesse experiences within the first act wouldn't persist after the film ends. Sure, he calls his parents, but that feels kinda hollow considering that it was just a ruse so he could get a gun. Therefore, during any potential rewatch of Breaking Bad, you could probably skip El Camino, since the only relevant detail is that he escaped, something which you could have just inferred from the ending of Felina. In comparison, Saul Gone is an integral part of Jimmy's journey, considering how it flips Saul's character on its head. It also acts as a definitive ending to Jimmy's story, one which we wouldn't have gotten without this episode. Not only that, it also acts as a definitive ending to the Breaking Bad universe as a whole, considering that it gives us closure and further details about the lives of other characters within this world. Therefore, any viewing of Better Call Saul without it would feel incomplete.